You're listening to Inspire Change, a broadcast that strives to educate, motivate, and empower men to challenge traditions of masculinity. To guide us through the intricacies and intersections of emotions, relationships, and male identity is renowned psychologist, author, and speaker Gunter. This is Inspire Change.
I want to introduce a tradition here for this podcast and all future podcasts, wherein I'd like to respectfully acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. They are the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet. I pay my respects to the elders, past and present. Knowing the stories of the Aboriginal people will always be written in this landscape. So I hope you enjoyed the last episode where I took a little bit of a look at a very interesting man who's written a book that I'm still pursuing and still reading called A History of Masculinity, From Patriarchy to Gender Justice. And I think it's one of those books that are extraordinarily important to read if we're going to be talking and looking at making some important social changes. So, where do I want to pick up today? Well, one of the things that occurred to me is that we don't necessarily shine a spotlight on the men who have supported equality between the genders, but also between races, ethnic groups, and so on. Okay, because in principle, there is a common thread running between all of these. And but for the sake of where we're at, I really want to spend time focusing on the issue of gender. And so I thought, we'd basically take a bit of a quick deep dive into history about where men were at with this whole process and what was going on with men who stood up, who advocated on behalf of for or with women about equality and pursuing equality. So, American sociologist Michael Kimmel categorized American male responses to feminism at the turn of the 20th century into three categories, basically. So he talked about the pro-feminist, the masculinist, and the anti-feminist. So obviously the category titles almost speak for themselves, but the one that I thought was really interesting was the category of the masculinist, and he believes that this particular movement was characterized by men's groups and developed as an indirect reaction to perceived feminization of manhood. Now that's very interesting because during the 80s I was involved in the first men's movement. And a lot of that was characterized by exactly what we're talking about. So, men felt that we needed to take another look, a closer look of what it means to be a man, what it means to be able to express our sexuality, our masculinity. How do we do that? How do we define it? But also one very important aspect to it was how do we express our emotions? And quite often the main emotions that were sort of dealt with was sadness and anger. And a lot of this circulated around the sense of, being somehow suppressed as men by the movement of the feminists. And I was really uncomfortable with that. It wasn't very explicit, but the undertone was always there. And it concerned me because I don't believe that that's necessarily what we need to do. My view is that patriarchy shackles men and women in different ways, and sometimes in similar ways. So, this is an important distinction. Okay. So what actually, on a sort of bit of a historical timeline, happened with, the movement towards equality with women? So interestingly enough, when we look at a bit country by country, and we look at when did women get the vote, Uh, New Zealand, interestingly enough, was the first country out of the blocks. That happened in 1893. It became the first permanent and independent country to pass suffrage laws. So, here's this little colony at the bottom of the world, and they're making a leap, a monumental leap, about equality within their community between the genders. Okay, now, at that point, and still today, there are serious issues about working towards the equality between Polynesian or Maori indigenous people and the Pakeha, the white settlers and their descendants. But it is also a country that is, in my view, leading the way, even on that level. Now, the second country to come up with, a suffrage act for women was Australia, and that happened in 1902. And the shame of this was that it applied to all women bar Aboriginal women who were left out. And I think that, we continue to have some serious problematic issues in how we, as a society, perceive and implement equity between different communities, different groups, and especially with the First Nations. And, for me, as someone living in this country, it does represent a point of sadness that we still haven't got this together. Okay, let me head over to the United States. The United States actually took quite a while, and the reason why I'm bringing it into now, because it's not chronological, is that there was some things going on in the United States that I found very, very interesting when I started doing some of this research. The 1855 marriage protest, I think, was, a very interesting event. Women's rights advocates Lucy Stone and her partner Henry Blackwell, in their marriage ceremony, refused to honour laws that interfered with the rights of married women. Okay, so, you got to think about this in context. In those days, women were essentially passed from one man to the next. So it was father to, husband. And within that context, they had virtually no essential rights to property, to the participation in the political sphere or in business. And so this move meant that they advocated for wives to be able to legally exist outside of a husband's control, to inherit and own property and have a right to wages. Now, these days we might sort of see that as a given. They don't, that's obvious, isn't it? But, I often need to remind women who protest that they're not feminists that if that were truly the case, then they needed to surrender that which feminism has granted them, and that ability is to participate in social, political, and economic spheres without the dependence on a male. So, she doesn't need to ask my permission to take out a loan and buy a house or, to have a job, something which is inherent in equity. So another event that really caught my attention was that in 1848, the first known women's rights convention in the world took place in Seneca Falls, New York. And they declared that men and women are created equal. And as such, the feminists gathered, demanded that women immediately be given rights and privileges due to them as United States citizens. So the gender differentiation was challenged very clearly through the rights of a citizen. But we can actually track some of this movement back further. Like if we look at the 1700s, There were lots of influential women who spoke out about women's rights from time to time. Abigail Adams, the wife of the second president, John Adams, asked her husband directly to remember the ladies in a letter in which he discussed disparities in women's and men's education. Really important point. And so that also included women like Hannah More, Mary Wollstonecraft, Judith Sargent, Murray. They all came together and banded towards a more egalitarian level of education for boys and girls. And so this was an advocacy for women to have influence over social, moral, religious, and political discussions. Stuff that still needs to be brought out very clearly, particularly in the advent of the dismantling of Roe versus Wade. Okay. Also, during the French Revolution, a woman called Olympe de Gouges wrote and published the Declaration of the Rights for Women and the Citizens. In this, she called for women to have free speech, include the right to name the father of their children, and equality for out-of-wedlock children, who were, seen as bastards, a derogatory comment that's still quite often used, especially in this particular instance. So there was a lot of stuff that was going on. Now, if we simply think that this is as a result of only women, then we're missing some of the picture, because with these women were many, many men, unfortunately not enough, but who stood as allies, as advocates, and as supporters of the women involved in this social issue. So, some of them, interestingly enough, a lot of this happened in France. A lot of the men were sort of pro-feminist authors who came out of the French social sort of Enlightenment period and philosophical schools. There were, Denis Diderot and Montesquieu. He was a writer, and he introduced female characters like Roxanne in Persian Letters, who clearly subverted patriarchal systems. But there were also liberals like the utilitarian Jeremy Bentham, who insisted on equal rights for women in every sense, not just, little areas, in little pockets of the law. And so that was, particularly important. Another guy, he was a British legal historian, Sir Henry Maine. John Stuart Mill, guy I studied in philosophy when I was at university. It was really interesting. Authored The Subjection of Women and presented a women's petition to the British Parliament, where he supported an amendment to the 1867 Reform Bill. And fundamentally, his efforts focused on the problems of married women. It was clearly an acknowledgement that marriage for Victorian women was predicated on sacrificing liberty, rights, and property. That's something that continued. I mean, I often have chats with women about issues of liberty and access to public domain. It wasn't until in the early 1970s that most women could take out a loan from the bank to purchase property. I think it was in 1973 they still asked women to bring a male guarantor. So these changes in society were both initiated by women, supported by men, and we need to continue to do this. We need to stay on top of this. The game hasn't finished. Patriarchy still rules. We, in fact, have a backlash. If you look at Afghan society today, and if you go back to the 60s, it's, they have regressed into the 7th century. Sharia law does not acknowledge women as equals, no matter how much they argue it. The idea of the veil is an ancient tradition that goes back to the Assyrian culture, and it is about that idea of chastity, purity, that men do not have to adhere to. Right? So, one of the things that I argue in this context is that there is a fundamental immorality in equality. And those of us who want to be good men, great men, have a fundamental duty of care to dismantle inequality. It is a moral pursuit. If you do not address inequality in our society, you are not on board either morally or politically with the democratic process. You have shunned it. Most of the men that I know who are on that line of the fence, the anti-feminists, are immoral in their behaviour, in their social position. There's no other way to argue this. So if we're going to create a just and equitable society wherein men and women can thrive irrespective of gender, creed, colour, religion, then this is in of itself the fundamental meeting point, the deconstruction, the social deconstruction of patriarchy. This is why I'm so passionate about this. And we have men, we have noisy men who are very out there with their pro-feminism, and we have the quiet achievers, those people who quietly acknowledge that men by definition have privilege and that we need to take responsibility for that, and we need to level the playing field. And that in its smallest possible way, I as a male, in no matter what environment I am an ally in the pursuit of equality. In other words, if you aren't part of the solution, you really are part of the problem. So, for those of us who are a little bit utilitarian, I urge you to think about this from the point that it's not only the right moral thing to do, but it's also the smart thing to do. The more egalitarian a culture, a society is, the better that society does. Physically, psychologically, socially, emotionally, and financially. It's a real given. It's a bit like when, as men, we're in a healthy relationship, in an egalitarian relationship, in a loving relationship. We live 7 years longer than the poor schmucks who haven't found it yet, or who try to move into patriarchal relationships where they operate from a dominance and control perspective. That's not healthy. So if you want to be healthy, I appeal to your, selfishness in a way. Change. Get on board. Move forward, because ultimately the change is going to be inevitable. Some battles are lost, but the war will be won. Just some food for thought. In the next session, I want to do a little bit more of that. There's some modern men who are very out there and who should be acknowledged for their work in this space. I want to talk a little bit about them. I also want to continue with the issue about the immorality of inequality. Until next time, this is me signing off. For those of us who want to be great men, that includes being moral, that includes focusing on equity, and it means focusing on democracy, true democracy. Until next time, this is me signing off.
Thank you for listening to Inspire Change, a broadcast that strives to educate, motivate, and empower men to challenge traditions of masculinity. For more information on the Making Good Men Great movement, or for individual or group coaching sessions with Gunter, visit makinggoodmengreat.com. For inquiries regarding broadcast topics or appearing on the show, email Miranda at noirtainment.com. That's Miranda at NOIRTAINMENT.com.